Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. And welcome to 6 Degrees Vancouver. My name is Jocelyn McDougall, and I will be with you through the entire day today. This event, this really remarkable, exciting event that we're all present for, that we're all going to participate in here today, is the result of a collaboration between the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, SFU Public Square, SFU International, and Vancity. So before telling you a little bit more about what we're going to do today, it is my great pleasure to invite up to the stage Andrew Petter, president of Simon Fraser University, and Paula Martin, advisor to the CEO of Vancity.
Well, thank you very much, Jocelyn, and thank you, Shane, for that truly wonderful welcome. And I, too, would like to join with Shane in acknowledging the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, on whose lands we live and work and play on a daily basis. And welcome to 6 Degrees Vancouver. We're honored to have with us the Right Honorable Adrienne Clarkson and John Ralston Saul, himself an honorary degree recipient from Simon Fraser University. We're thrilled that they've brought this dialogue to SFU to gain a West Coast perspective on how we can create a more inclusive and welcoming Canada. As Canada's most community-engaged research university, we're delighted as well to be partnering with Vancity. Vancity has been a tremendous supporter of SFU and of the community, and we've worked together on numerous events. Thanks as well to the event co-presenters, SFU International and SFU Public Square, 6 Degrees, and the Institute of Canadian Citizenship. And as you'll see, we have an amazing lineup of speakers for today, and we have in the audience a wonderful collection of people from around Metro Vancouver, many of whom are tirelessly involved in championing diversity and inclusivity. This event confronts us with the question, are you home in Canada? In doing so, it requires us to consider what is home? What does it mean to be home? Except for Indigenous peoples, we're all visitors to this land, some more recent than others. And as we all know, Indigenous peoples were dispossessed of their lands by those who came here from other parts of the world. So what does it mean to be home? For me, home is more than a physical space. It's a sense of community, a sense of security, a place of belonging. But it cannot be dissociated from history. It must not ignore or romanticize the wrongs of the past. I well remember in the 1990s when I was privileged to be British Columbia's Aboriginal Affairs Minister, sitting in a restaurant in Terrace during talks with First Nations to begin the process of recognizing their Aboriginal title in their lands. I believe the restaurant was called the Pioneer Inn. And the placemat said something to the effect, the Pioneer Inn, dedicated to those brave pioneers who made this land their own. I carry that memory because it reminds me of how easy it is to discount or glamorize the injustices that we have visited on Indigenous peoples in claiming their homes to be our homes. I carry that memory with me because it reminds me of how important it is that we rectify those injustices and make real the process of reconciliation. Universities have an important part to play in this regard, and we at SFU have established an Aboriginal Reconciliation Council to help guide us as we endeavor to do all we can to support the reconciliation process. At the same time, I'm mindful of the responsibility that we have to support Canada's commitments to diversity and multiculturalism, and to create a sense of home for those who come here as immigrants and as refugees. This includes working with all members of our communities to foster an inclusive sense of belonging. And the power of doing so really became evident to me just a few months ago, when in response to President Trump's travel ban, I issued a statement on behalf of the university affirming our commitments to equity and diversity and inviting the SFU community to gather to demonstrate our opposition to religious intolerance and xenophobia, and to show our support for Muslims and others who felt threatened or vulnerable in the wake of the president's actions and the subsequent shootings that took place at the Islamic Cultural Center in Quebec. And hundreds of students and faculty and staff came together to express their commitment to these beliefs and to each other. It was a powerful affirmation of Canadian values, made all the more so when a Muslim student who had immigrated to Canada just a few years ago said that for the first time she truly felt that she was Canadian. To me, this is what home feels like. This is what we mean when we speak of Canada as a welcoming and inclusive nation. And I believe that universities can be potent instruments for creating this sense of home by building bridges and strengthening civil society, by supporting evidence-based dialogue on issues of public importance, and promoting social equality, cross-cultural engagement, and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. For these reasons and more, Simon Fraser University is proud to host 6 Degrees Vancouver and to be part of building a better and more welcoming Canada. So thank you. It's great to see this turnout. It's wonderful to see you here today. I want to thank you for coming, and I now want to turn over the floor to our partner, Van City, and to Paula Martin.
Thank you, Andrew. And good morning, everyone. It's great to be in this space. I'm sure many of us have been here seeing different performances and cultural events. And so to see it transformed into this incredible space for dialogue is quite magical. I too would like to recognize that we're on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples and pay my respects to elders past and present of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I'd like to bring greetings from Tamara Vrooman, President and CEO of Van City. Unfortunately, Tamara was taken ill and is under the weather, as we say, and would love to be here with you and sends each and every one of you her best wishes for a robust dialogue and learning today. I was thinking last night, as I learned that I was going to be standing in for Tamara, what research could I do that would follow the president of SFU? And I decided none. So I thought about a story I would share with you. I grew up in Ottawa, one of the least diverse cities you could imagine in the 1960s. And I think if any of you heard Adrienne on CBC radio this morning, she alluded to that. As a kid, I was really curious, and my parents bought me a globe, and I spent countless hours in my bedroom spinning that thing around, looking at all the different colors of the countries, wondering who lived there, what they did, what the animals looked like, and, could I even go there? I didn't have the capability to do that at 8, so I wrote a story about a kangaroo. Her name was Hoppy McClellan, and she went all around the world visiting people I thought I would never get to meet. Obviously, the world has changed in the intervening decades, and for us to gather to understand what that means, I think is both a privilege and a responsibility. And I really look forward today to hearing the perspectives that each of us bring from our own corners of the world. And again, as a kid spinning a globe, I didn't realize that there were corners or edges, but now we know there are borders, and they may be real or they may be imposed. So hopefully today we can pull some of them apart. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew and Paula, for your thoughtful words, for your welcome, for your stories. Thank you. Okay, everybody. What are we even doing here? You got this invitation, you saw this thing, you were like, this will be interesting. I don't know what we're going to do. You know what you've all done? You've taken a leap. You've taken a leap of faith. You've taken a risk. That's what we're all doing here today. We are here to have a conversation. That's what we're going to do. And who am I? What am I doing here other than standing up here with a microphone? So again, my name is Jocelyn McDougall. I'm a convener and an organizer. I live here in Vancouver. And I have the great blessing and honor and privilege of shepherding you through this exciting conversation. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself because I'd like to learn a little bit about you maybe later throughout the day. So I'll start. What can I tell you? What can I tell you about who I am? Let's see. Well, I'm a queer femme. That's one thing about me. I am a cisgendered woman. So that means that my gender identity that I present to the world is aligned with the sex that I was assigned at birth. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. What else? I'm a feminist. I stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, with Idle No More. I'm an organizer. I'm a fundraiser. I'm a singer. I sing with a band, a Motown cover band called Queer as Funk. Why do I tell you these things about myself? Because I have a complex identity. I have an intersectional identity, as does every person in this room. And I'm complicated. I have a complicated history. I come from settler people. My people came and settled in Micmac territory in what is now Nova Scotia in the late 18th and early 19th century. There are some things about my ancestors that I'm super proud of. For example, my great-great-great-aunt, Euphemia McDougall, owned her own dressmaking business in the mid-1800s. I think that's pretty cool. I have a lot of sort of civic and business leaders in my lineage that make me very proud. And also, I have a very complicated relationship with being a settler in Canada and living on unceded territories and making my home and my life and my family here. And all of us have complicated stories. And that's what we're going to bring to this dialogue today. And that's why you've all taken a leap of faith, because we're going to get complicated together. And my job is to help create the container that will enable all of us to feel like we can get real. We can get really real. We're going to get real today. So in order to sort of create that container, I'm going to take a step back and talk about some housekeeping stuff. So of course, you all had some nice snacks and coffee. You'll be fed and watered throughout the day. Out in the lobby, there's bathrooms on each floor, except perhaps the main floor. But there's bathrooms in the lobby. We have on an all-gender bathroom, which is a single door in the middle of when you go down this hall and around the corner. There's the women's bathroom on one side, the men's bathroom in the other, and an all-gender bathroom in the middle that is also accessible. And I will let you know that if that door closes and no one's inside, it will lock. So please leave that all-gender bathroom door open if you're not inside, okay? What else will we talk about? Volunteers. So some of you may have been to this facility before, SFU Woodward's fantastic facility. If you haven't been here before, it can be a little bit of a maze. Not to worry. We have some outstanding volunteers in black t-shirts that say 6 Degrees Vancouver. You ask them anything, they'll tell you where you need to go. We love the volunteers. Thank you to all of them so much for giving of their time today. The social media. You know it, you love it, okay? So there's connectivity instructions in your programs. Sometimes it's a bit complicated. It takes a few tries. Don't give up, you'll get there. And when you do, please use the hashtag 6degreesyvr to share the conversation that we're having today. And also, we'd like to invite everyone, keep your valuables with you throughout the day. This is a public building. There's lots of folks going through it all day. So those things that matter to you, just keep them on your person as you move through the space today. Now, one of the other reasons I'm here is because I'm a self-proclaimed convening nerd, and I'm really excited about the format that we're going to use today. So at this time, I am very pleased to bring up with me here Charlie Ferran, the CEO of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, to talk to us a little bit more about the format that we're going to be using today. Hi, Charlie.
Jocelyn, thank you so much, and welcome everyone. 6 Degrees is trying to be a new way to gather together, a new way to talk, a new way to connect. Self-evident now, we do it in the round. Our mark, which you'll be seeing throughout the day right here on the stage, is the Indigenous Circle, as well as a cross of the Indigenous Circle and the European Warning Signal. Our intent is to, as much as possible over the next 8 hours, break down the barrier between what's on stage, who's on stage and who's off it. Throughout the day, we'll be encouraging you in different ways, using different means to participate, to feel that this is your day too, to feel that this conversation is a conversation you have been part of, not witness to. That is our intent and that is our hope. We're so very pleased you are willing to go along. This is our third time doing it. We did it in Toronto last fall. We just did it in the Netherlands 2 weeks ago in The Hague, and now we are delighted to be doing it in Vancouver. Already, I feel like everybody who's come up has given you a feeling for what the theme is, for what we're trying to explore. And as you run down the program, you see the different ways that we attempt to do it with a formal 360, which you'll be introduced to momentarily, with the breakout, with the lunch, with a second 360 hosted by John Ralsasol in the afternoon, and then with the open forum. To some extent, what we're driving towards is that 4 to 5 o'clock slot. So though I know a day is a big commitment, if you can, and again, as Jocelyn said, you'll be looked after, please stay with us, because it is in the final hour where we have to get somewhere. We have to get somewhere with language, with thinking, and with commitment, and we'll explain later how we're doing that. So, again, thank you for joining us, and Jocelyn, please carry us through to
Certainly.
the 360.
So I just want to reflect a little bit on our theme as well, which we have heard a bit about. Are we home? And I think I just want to name that it's an interesting conversation to have here in Vancouver. I mean, certainly we have an incredibly diverse community that we live within, but also right down to much more material questions. For example, let's not kid ourselves. It's hard to have a home in Vancouver right now. Housing is a difficult thing. And of course, it's an important moment in Canada, where we are observing the 150th anniversary of Confederation within a much longer history of people and land. And of course, in the context of the world, where we see displacement and migration at levels that we've never seen before, and the question of home is so salient for so many. So we're really excited. We're really excited. Can I say it again? Can I communicate it any better? We're just really excited that you have all chosen to be with us today. And because one of our biggest goals is to hear from as large a number of voices as possible today, what I'd like to do is just talk about some community agreements that I'd like for us all to consider as we move through a whole day of different kinds of conversations and dialogues. So the first thing that I'd like you to consider when you are offering your voice, which we hope that you do, is brevity. That's brevity. And I want to, I mean, it's hilarious, yes, brief, oh yes, let's be brief. But if you think of it, try to think of it through the context of the more brief that I am, the more I am demonstrating my desire to hear others' voices as well. So we invite you to think about brevity. We invite you to think about courage and respect. So I sort of said glibly earlier that we were going to get real, but I do mean that quite honestly, and I do hope that we can collectively hold a space that's safe enough for us to get real. Part of that means inviting everyone to have the courage to speak what is in their heart and what is in their mind, even if it doesn't match the prevailing conversation that might be happening at the moment. The other side of courage is respect, to understand that if somebody says something that you don't agree with, you are more than welcome to challenge them, but to do it from a place of compassion and respect. And then the third piece that I'd like to offer is this idea of leaning in or stepping back. So if you are the type of person who always throws their hand up first and says, I got something to say, I got an opinion about that, I'll tell you what I think, then I invite you to consider taking a step back and listening to perhaps what some other folks have to say before you offer your own voice. If you are the type of person who tends to sit and mull over and not be sure that exactly the words you want to say are perfect and you're not sure if you can perfectly articulate your thought, I want to invite you to lean in and give it a whirl. Try opening your mouth and sharing your voice before you've got the perfect language worked out. Give that a whirl. So once again, our community agreements with each other in order to protect our dialogue today. Number one, brevity. Number two, courage and respect. And number three, leaning in or stepping back. And now, here we are. I am so thrilled to introduce us to our very first 360, Feeling at Home. On stage with our hosts, we have journalist, filmmaker, and human rights activist, Nelifer Pazira. We have Aboriginal Relations Manager for the City of Vancouver, Ginger Gosnell-Myers. Festival producer, writer, and cultural curator, Suresh Rao. From the J.W. McConnell Family Foundation, Nathalie Chapdelaine. And the always handsome and charming writer, performer, and advocate, Ivan Coyote. Charlie, can we talk a little bit more about what is going to happen now that all these fine folks are sitting together on this stage?
We have 90 minutes. 90 minutes to have a conversation. It is officially a conversation at a kitchen table. Unofficially, officially, imaginatively. It's a conversation at a kitchen table. Informal. These 5 people with Adrienne Clarkson discussing, moving ideas forward, contending, exchanging. At the same time, as soon as possible, Jocelyn and I are going to begin seeking people from the floor, from this space, this shared space, to intervene, to stand up and contribute. It can happen in 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Our intent is to push the conversation forward to where it needs to be at the end of 90 minutes. It is our delight and pleasure that you feel that this is your exchange, your 360 as well.
So I want to give you one more heads up before we get rolling. Okay, so this is my job, right? I'm trying to take us through the day, let you know what's happening. So we're going to have this conversation. We're going to invite folks to intervene. When you have a thought, when you have an idea, when you have a comment that's going to move the dialogue forward, you let Charlie and I know and we will facilitate that. After the 360 session, we'll have a short break. And then we're going to move into our open exchanges. Now, this is an opportunity for us to take threads that emerge in the conversation we're about to have and carry them forward. You know what? We're talking about home. We're talking about feeling at home. This is enormous. This is an enormous subject area. It could go so many different directions. I have no doubt that there will be threads that come up in this conversation that don't get followed all the way to their end. So you may think, oh, that was a thing. I'd really like to talk more about that. Ooh, but that was completely missed. Nobody said anything about that. I'd like to talk about that. We are going to invite anyone who feels so compelled to step forward immediately after this conversation and pitch an open exchange session. So that means 12 of you, or maybe 8, or maybe 4, we'll see, will stand up. I'll invite, the time will be clear. I will help you get there. But I will invite you to come up and say, my name is Jocelyn McDougall, and I realize that I would like to have, excuse me, I would like to have a continuing conversation about housing in Vancouver, for example. And then we'll have the next, and each one of those will get distributed throughout the venue, and those conversations will take place. So they are emergent from this dialogue that we will have. I'm going to talk more about it in the details after we're finished here, but I want you to be thinking about that in case that's something that you feel compelled to do. Well, we're here. I would like, no, that's the end of my notes. It's not the end of the day yet. And now, finally, I'd like to ask the 26th Governor General of Canada and the co-founder and co-chair of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, Adrienne Clarkson, to start us at 360, Feeling at Home.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. I couldn't feel more at home than I do amongst all of you, and having been presented with this wonderful carving by Shane. I do want to remind, as we all know, we are on unceded territory of the Coast Salish, the Squamish, the Musqueam. The word that I emphasize in all of that, because you know all the other names, is unceded. So when we talk about people not being able to buy homes in Vancouver, let us remember that we are on land that belongs to somebody else, not most of us. There are some of us here to whom it belongs. Richard, Shane, people. But otherwise, we are here as occupiers. And no matter how many funny old white lieutenant governors say we came to an empty land and made it beautiful, and we developed all of this, and this was ours, this is not right. When I was growing up in Ottawa, as Paula pointed out, I grew up earlier than she did, in the 40s, very white bread town. We talked about Indians, and we were given beaver boards, and we were told to collect pieces of cedar and little pieces of birch bark and make a project which would show how Indians had lived. And we were given little doll stick figures that we could dress in the fur, in the little pieces of fur that we brought. Nobody ever mentioned to us that there was a reserve 40 miles away at Maniwaki of Algonquin people. I never met a single Indigenous person until I went to university, very fortunately, with the descendant of Joseph Brant, Guy Brant, of the Six Nations. And ever since then, I have been very, very aware of what we are. And because I am such a newcomer to the country, because I came, as many of you know, as a refugee when I was 3 years old with my family on a Red Cross boat, not knowing where we would be, being dropped off in New York and then coming by train to Ottawa, being welcomed by people in the middle of a war. I was the same age as little Alan Kurdi, whose picture made it around the world, lying face down dead on a beach. We were on a boat too, only ours was a safer boat, because it happened to be a Red Cross one, but those are fate things. And I stand before you as Adrienne Clarkson, that's how you know me, but I am grandmother of many nations to the Blood Tribe of Southern Alberta. I take that very seriously, as I always took seriously my role as the representative of the Crown, and in reenacting in many historic ceremonies while I was Governor General, the treaties, I would reenact the part of the Crown. And always I would read that part at the end which said, and this treaty is made nation to nation, and will be as good for as long as the rivers flow, the sun shines, and the grass grows. We, the newcomers, the settlers to this country, betrayed that, okay? And that is what we must always remember. We betrayed it. So when we talk about belonging, or when we talk about home, we have to say, what does that mean? When I decided with John that we would start this Institute for Canadian Citizenship when I left Rideau Hall, I felt I would do it because I felt the passion for it, having come here, having been accepted, having started with absolutely nothing, because we had one suitcase each, my mother, my father, my brother, and I, and starting out with nothing and becoming Governor General of Canada. I thought, that's an arc of a story which everybody in Canada should have access to and know. And I was always very proud of little children in grade 6 who always felt that. They would write me letters and say, now that you're Governor General, I think that I could become Governor General too. And that's what I want them to think. Listening to the traffic report on Rick Clough's show this morning, I heard there was traffic blocked up at the Massey Bridge and the Willingdon Bridge. Those were nice old white men who were Governors General before me. And they have bridges, and underpasses named for them. Willingdon looked terrible in little silk tights. He was in the ballroom at Rideau Hall. And Massey was our first Canadian Governor General, and a wonderful one, and started us off on a whole new way of looking at Canada. But I feel for the idea of belonging that it can be very complex. It's not a matter of being loved. It's not a matter of people saying, we want you, only you, your personality, everything about you, only you, we love you. That's not what necessarily belonging means. Belonging means a place where you can be without threat. And in the words of one poet, which I always go back to and like, and it's in a poem about an old tramp who goes back to a place where he worked once when he's dying. And he says, home is the place where when you've got to go there, they must take you in. And in many ways, the story of a lot of us is we had to come here, or we chose it because things were going to perhaps be better than where we were, or because we didn't have much of a choice. And that's what makes us what we are. And I think that's why we are who we are. And that's why we have the people we have here who, in talking to them, represent all sorts of things. They represent the Indigenous experience. They represent a feeling that they belonged in the North, but they know, what the Yukon is and what it isn't. They know what it's like to be born in Afghanistan and have to live somewhere else. Ginger Gosnell is the relative of a man I admire, one of the great admirable men of Canada, Joe Gosnell, and of the royal assent that I gave, which I consider to have been the most important, which was the treaty in 2000, which the Nisga'a people negotiated after Joe Gosnell had spent 25 years of his life doing that, and his father before him had spent that time. And Maria Chapdelaine, who is, as the French Canadians say, pure laine, 18 generations in Canada. Shirish Rao, seven years. So you were talking, Ivan, about belonging, and you still feel that you belong in the Yukon, but that isn't the only place that you belong. That isn't the only place where you feel at home. And you did?
I'm a third-generation Yukoner. My grandmother and my grandfather on the one side went up in 1949. My other side, to my other family, 1952. And my grandmother used to say that the only two reasons, if you weren't Indigenous or born in the Yukon, the only two reasons that you would ever go north would be love or money. In their case, it was money. My grandfather went to work on the highway, the grand colonizer of the North, I think, at that time, the Alaska Highway. And I left, like many people do, to go to post-secondary. There was no options to study anything except for welding, and you could go to trade school. But if you wanted to do any kind of university, you had to leave. So I also am an East Vancouverite since 1987. So technically, I've lived here longer than I was at home, but I still reference home as the Yukon, which is Tlingit territory, Northern Shoshone, Twenjaquichin, specifically Tlingit from the part of Whitehorse where I'm from. Yeah. Yes.
And what about you, Natalie? Do you feel that you belong in Quebec? You still work in Montreal. Is that your place, or what about the rest of Canada to you? What about coming to Vancouver?
I was speaking a little bit with Peter somewhere over there. Hi, earlier this morning. I don't know if my case is representative of most of people who were born in Quebec, but I have to admit that outside of Ottawa and perhaps one or two places in the Maritimes, the first time I went west was like in my 30s. So my understanding of Canada was very limited up until, a certain age. Because, well, quite the opposite is you. When you're a Francophone in Quebec and you want to go to university, well, you kind of stay in Quebec. You don't necessarily dream of going to Anglophone universities because you don't have to, because your language is French. So I'm a very typical person in that sense. I was born in Montreal, raised in Montreal, went to 2 universities in Montreal. Eventually, I thought that there was a world out there, and so I turned myself to Europe and France because, that's where we come from. So my history goes back to France. At some point, the very first Chapdelaine apparently came from a place near the Mont Saint-Michel. So that's the funny thing about Canada. We can all say where it all started, except for First Nations, I guess, because it goes back to generations. But there was a TV show recently, and I just couldn't help but thinking that in Europe, they can't trace their history all that long, but in Canada, you can, because there's the first person who came here, and it's just a strange feeling that you can do that. I have friends, because of some of their ancestry, cannot go very far back in their arbre généalogique. Help me out here. Thank you.
Genealogy.
Oh, there's some understanding of French in the audience. Great. So, yeah, I do feel Montreal is home. This is where I was born and raised, and there's a feeling to Montreal that I really connect to.
Well, do you get a feeling of home from other places more quickly? Do you feel at home in different places? Do you feel, Ginger, that all of Canada is part of you, or do you feel that Nisga'a territory is more part of you, or the West Coast is more part of you?
Well, I feel like a real Vancouverite, having lived here, similar to Ivan, longer than I've lived in my home territory of the Nisga'a Nation. But I can't ever divorce myself from the memories of living in my community, the smells that are unique to my home, the foods that only we know intimately, and the harvesting of the foods and the cooking and the eating. I mean, there's just so much intimate connection to the land and to the soil and to the air and to the smells that I can't compare to my life here in Vancouver, which is also my home. You know, I have multiple homes, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's natural. I think it's good. But if you ask me where my heart is, I think I'll give you a different answer depending on how I'm feeling.
That is, I think that is the core of it. Where do you feel when you wake up? If you think you want to feel at home, where do you feel at home? I have to say that I've always loved mushrooms a lot. And when I went to visit the Nisga'a Nation with Joe, it was mushroom season, and I harvested matsutake mushrooms in the forest and loved that, and was very happy that was a big cash crop for the nation in Japan.
Yeah.
But that, I think, you know, those little things, the little things of the details of life, as opposed to the grandiose, you know, what is the political party that is in power in your home now? You know, how is it that you come from, originally from Afghanistan, Nellifer, you know, watching it on a macro scale as though you were able to have that kind of, you know, insight into it because you came from there. Do you think that gives you a sense more that you understand or that you are part of it?
I actually like the word complicated. I feel that I belong everywhere, but I don't belong anywhere. Mm-hmm. And for me, the idea of home began with a troubling question or challenge of geography. And I think that's not unique to me. All first-generation immigrants, including yourself and your family, would have had to struggle with the idea of a certain part of the world that you feel you belong to, and that's geography. And the challenge for me is that geography is attached to borders and boundaries and to the sense of politics, nationalism, culture, so many layers of it that I had to question as a first-generation refugee. I also have to say that here in Canada, we have been fortunate that, you know, through your efforts and all the others, we have begun a process of acknowledging, you know, whose geography are we actually standing upon. And there are a lot of other parts of the world, and I must say today is the anniversary of the Armenian genocide, where people have been wiped out of their territories, their homes, by the Turks at the time in 1915, and people are still refusing to acknowledge their right that they even existed, let alone come as far as reconciliation. So it is a troubling question for me at the personal level, that do I attach myself to a certain geography? Is it inhibiting? Is it limiting? And therefore, not a solution, but a kind of a way, a process out of it for me is the feeling that I belong to many places. I live between 3 different continents pretty much throughout the last 15 years of my life. And I feel that I have a certain degree of connection to certain places, and I love Canada as a country that have given me the opportunities. My connection to Canada is deeply rooted in the experience of coming as a refugee, but when it comes to belonging, I have a lot of questions.
What about that for you? You came because you fell in love with somebody who brought you here.
Mm-hmm. Good reason.
And it's one of the best, and it's one of the most
optimal. Now we have love. We had money, and now it's love.
Yes, exactly. Money and love. There we are. And so the love brought you here. But obviously, you could not have stayed, or you might have said to her, "Why don't we go back to where I come from, where I like the food better, and I like the smells better." I think this is very real to all of us.
Yeah.
I like the smells better, and I like the climate better, because we've found in the Institute that we have these wonderful round tables when we have ceremonies for citizenship, and we always ask at the end of the round tables, well, if you like all these things that you've gotten with the political freedom, what don't you like? And it's 99% it's the weather.
Right.
So it's, that's the only problem. I don't think we really have that many problems. Well, what about coming here because in a way, it was a choice that was emotional, but it was through a person.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we were talking a bit about what really makes home, and it occupied me for a while because it's kind of a trick question, what really makes you, in a way. But to me, a home is where I'm able to offer hospitality and where I'm able to be hospitable. And I think, so that in that sense, it escapes sometimes geography. It changes over time. And for me, over here, I was able to feel that. In this building too, where I've often produced events, for example, I feel a little bit at home here compared to someone who's outside. So the size of that depends on, if it's someone from another country, home could be Canada. If it's someone from another city, home is Vancouver. If it's someone from Vancouver, home is my house. So it shrinks and expands depending on that.
I love that idea of that you just said, which is that it's where you can offer hospitality.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think in a lot of cultures, and I think that's true in the Far East, it's certainly true of the Chinese, of the Japanese, they feel, any reticence people feel often about being at home or meeting other people is because they feel they can't offer hospitality.
Well, you can safely oppress someone with your hospitality.
Feed them too much sugar and things like that.
Overfeed them,
yes.
Keep them,
yes.
prevent them from leaving.
I'll tell you a story, which was that, when you're a member of the Order of Canada, you can preside over citizenship ceremonies. And this is always a wonderful thing. It's a thing to aspire to be an Order of Canada, so you can run citizenship ceremonies. They're the most wonderful things to be part of. And I did my first one in about 1992 because my office, that was why they asked me, my office was across the street from the building where they wanted to hold the ceremony. So they said, by the way, would you like to do this? So I did, and we did the ceremony. It was quite nice, except it was held in a police station, which very modern one. And I thought, a lot of these people probably don't want to be in a police station swearing their oath of citizenship, but the sensitivities were not what they are now. Yeah. And at the end of it, it just sort of broke up. And there was no coffee. There was no nothing. So the next time the next time I was asked, I contacted the local MP, and I said, look, could you give me $200, and I'll get a coffee machine, and I'll buy some Timbits. And at least at the end, we can give out something like that. And because the second one I had been to, this was the third one when I asked for that, the second one I had been to, at the end of it, there was nothing. And then this lovely Indian family with 4 children that had become citizens brought out these brown paper bags with pakoras in them and gave them to everybody, the 40-odd people, all the people running the ceremony. Yeah. We were all given a pakora. Yeah. And I thought, they were so generous, and you could tell that they were not prosperous or anything. They had just had the idea that giving food was hospitality, and they wanted to be generous. And it was really quite wonderful. So I got money then. And that was the genesis of the idea for the Institute of Canadian Citizenship to have special ceremonies where at the end we have coffee and Timbits. Mm-hmm. And it's not the amount of food, it's not how fancy it is in the offering. And that I think, it comes back to our Native peoples as well. They always offer. And always offer, in some way, some of our ethnic origin, white European people, were not into offering. And it made for a sense in our country, I think, that was not about hospitality. So but how does that reflect with the hospitality idea? How does that reflect on making people feel that they can be part of things that you are part of, in running a festival as you do? How do you translate your sense of hospitality into that?
Well, I mean, that's in a way why I also really like this idea where everyone's around and you can sort of lean over and chat, because to me, if there's something I would like to bring in this spirit of hospitality to Vancouver or to Canada is a sense of garrulousness, is a sense that we can talk a bit louder and interrupt each other a little bit more, and it's okay if we're all talking at the same time, because there is something in that bubble and rustle of voices that then something pops up and you mine the treasures. So I think through the festival, it's really an act of starting a conversation. You put it out there and then you see what happens. So I'm interested in and talking too much.
Hey, Adrian, speaking of Garrulous, Jocelyn and I are looking for early interveners.
I was
Is it-
going to say, can we get some other
No-
sense
Yes,
Yes,
I
please.
was
about
looking at
conversations?
Richard Atleo, who is here and is such a much admired philosopher and West Coast person, and I'd like to hear what you think about what we've just been saying and thinking about.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm a bit hard of hearing, so I didn't get everything that was said. Probably fortunately, I don't know, unfortunately. But I did appreciate the introduction that you provided. And there is a translation into where I come from, because I was born into my own culture, into my own language. I had to learn English, which is my second language. And it took me until university to begin to understand some of the English words of this society.
You mean the concepts behind the words?
Yes.
Okay.
And I was already a big boy. My aunt asked me one time, "Are you comfortable?" I didn't know what she was saying. What does that mean, are you comfortable? That was not my language. So anyway, there is a word in my language, isok, which means respect, which doesn't translate very easily into the English version of respect. Because, and you said something about love, and that being home is not necessarily about, well, you want somebody to love you so that you can feel at home. Well, respect is like that in an Nonchalant way. When respect is an attribution of value to some being or any being, simply because the being, we all come from the same source, right? So you don't have to like someone you respect. You don't have to love someone you respect. And you could actually be disagreeable to someone, but you can still respect a person or a being or a plant or an animal. And so there you have a system of looking at the world, of looking at living beings, whether they're plants, animals, or other humans, in a way that respects, it translates into practical things, like respecting boundaries, respecting who owns resources, and what to do when you have resources juxtaposed with different beings, such as plants or animals or human beings. And we have stories that illustrate how to get along with when you have conflicting situations. So we learned how to do that, not perfectly, but in a way that surpasses, in my view, the way in which modern society conducts itself today, all around the globe. Now that's that's a huge statement, but it's just my personal view. Right? So I think that indigenous people have something from their ancient way of life. If you extract, say, the best from it, you can pull out something beautiful, which is human, something beautiful, which is possible, something beautiful, which provides hope. Right? So thank you.
I think providing hope is the most wonderful thing, because this is so interesting about the love thing. All you need is not love. Right? And sometimes people mistake the fact that when we accept or we respect and so on, that we must love. And you don't. I mean, I always think that we must accept people and we must give them space, even though we don't like them. We don't want to share a bus shelter with them, even if it's raining. We don't want to sit down and have a sandwich with them. But they have the right to living as we were all, as the Koran says, as Native people's sense of being concedes, as all the religions are. We were all created by a single creator. And therefore, we are a part of one project, no matter whether we fit together or not in that way. I think that's really one. Yes.
But then I feel even if we don't have to love, shouldn't we all do something about empathy? One of the things that I'm trying to work on and that really enlightened me is by knowing someone, by understanding a little bit more of their story, where they come from. I don't necessarily love them, but I will get to feel some empathy for them and then respect. In your example of not wanting to share the bus stop, perhaps it's a homeless person that smells really bad. I don't want to be there. But that person has a story. And more and more and more, and through the arts especially, we can shed a light on so many stories and experiences. And I think that it's our job to be aware of those histories and those stories, to eventually not necessarily love, but at least have some empathy to being actors of changing something for being more welcoming and hospitable to people. I don't know.
I know what you mean, and in my case, it's sharing the bus shelter would be, I wouldn't, maybe it may be more the person from Goldman Sachs I wouldn't want to do it with.
That too. That too.
I'd be very happy
Adrian, we
share
have
it with the homeless
Jocelyn
person.
has an interview.
I'd love to invite Julie to offer some words.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having us here today. It really is an honor to be here. I'd like to talk about being at home as a place from which I can be a witness. And this is in contribution to what you're speaking about, being comfortable and thinking about the place from which I can say, what am I looking at? What does it mean? And I guess everyone here has a complicated history, so I won't go into mine. But in terms of that question, what am I looking at in hospitality, if we're here being welcomed by the people of First Nations on this unceded land, what does it mean to read a report that SFU is going to be canceling the First Nations program? What does that mean in terms of hospitality? Thank you.
Okay.
So I didn't get that last part, that SFU would be...
Is canceling a program, First Nations program?
Something like that.
The president wants to talk to that?
I'd love to. There's been a follow-up email sent out this morning by the provost trying to clarify the situation. We have taken some major strides, I think, at SFU, working with Indigenous students and Indigenous communities to try to ensure that we are more accessible and more supportive through our Indigenous Student Center and the like. We have struggled with a particular bridging program that has not been successful in either attracting sufficient students to create the kind of cohort or have those students go on and be successful. And the provost of the university made the decision that rather than continue with that program, a better way forward would be to initiate a process of consultation with First Nations students and communities to try to create a program that will be more sustainable. There's another issue without getting too deeply into the weeds, and that is the initial program was funded on what's called soft money, that is temporary money. And the provost has said that that's no longer a sustainable situation and has committed for permanent ongoing funding. Unfortunately, I think the message that went out was received in a way that, and perhaps was communicated in a way that simply focused on the shutting down of the existing program, and that's hugely unfortunate. Because the whole intention here is to create a program that is more effective, more inclusive, and works with First Nations and other Indigenous students to meet their goals, with them, not for them, and that's the spirit in which we're moving forward. So one struggles to meet the needs and expectations because there are so many of Indigenous peoples. I think we let people down in the way we communicated this. I think the intentions were good, and hopefully the recommunication of what those intentions are will provide a basis for moving forward in a way that reassures people that our intention is not, in fact, to take a step backwards, but quite the opposite, to take many steps forward.
I think Ginger wants to comment on that.
Yeah, and trying to bring it back to our theme here of feeling at home, I've been grappling with this sense of disempowerment that I feel Canadians unknowingly have. And it's coming off of Suresh's comments on, do we feel comfortable enough to host? Do we feel comfortable enough to share a meal and to host and to welcome you? And I don't see that enough. I recognize that 150 years as country's growth is still quite new. But I don't feel like, as citizens, we have enough self-empowerment to create the processes or the systems or even the environments that we really want to see. And I think going back to the program that was just addressed for Indigenous students, we've had so many failed programs directed at us that we had no input in creating. And a lot of what we're doing today is inserting our voice and taking a step back and having the difficult conversations on what will work and why it will take a lot of time in order for it to work. We are still very much in a place of overcoming a set of histories and harms done to us that it's going to take a long time to work things out so that it's right. But I think all Canadians would really benefit if we also committed time, thought, conversation to make this truly home, so that in the next 20 years, we will be much more welcoming to everybody.
But that has to be explained to Canadians too. And I feel that a lot of that is lacking. And it's lacking in different ways. In different provinces, it's happening in different ways. Manitoba and Saskatchewan, we have the former Treaty Commissioner here from Saskatchewan, David Arnott, he's now the Human Rights Commissioner there. They've handled it in different ways. In many ways, we felt going across the country, as we did 10, 15 years ago all the time, that they were in the forefront with that size of province and that kind of commitment. And perhaps now with things really booming in this area, we're being left out of the comprehension scale. And I think you probably have something to address in that way too. Ivan, yeah.
Yeah, just to follow up a little bit about, so we do this thing, and I think it's a great thing, and I see it more and more in the last couple of years of acknowledging the traditional territories that we're standing on. But that's where we stop a lot of times. Yeah. And I always think, how are we on the traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh people, and Coast Salish? I wonder that every time, and then I think, that's probably my colonizer mind, not understanding how I could possibly be on the territory of 3 different nations at the same time. I obviously don't understand this. So why are we not, I get the program thing, in Aboriginal studies or Indigenous studies, but why are we not teaching this right off the bat in every single public and private school all across the country about, like, I'm from Tlingit territory, and I was very lucky that I was part of a weird pilot program that probably was soft money, I guess, because it just dissipated after a couple of years. But in grade 6, instead of taking French, and then I did take French afterwards, I took Tlingit language. The elders came into our class and taught us beadwork, and it blew my mind because I understood so much more, because I was taught that a table is not a table. A table is something you put your laptop on, unless you put your lunch on it, and then it's something that you put your lunch on. They don't have nouns in Tlingit language like we do. A chair is only a chair when you sit on it, but you don't call it a chair, you call it something you sit on. Unless you stand on it, then it's something that you stand on. And that blew my mind. And then when I traveled with Slavey translators, when I was storytelling in the Northwest Territories, I found out that they don't count the same way we do. They don't have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. They have enough, too much, not plenty, just enough. And that's how they count. And so my big question is, as we go into this 150 years celebration, is that language not a full-on insult from the get-go? And, as an artist, of course, I'm going to be asked to come, and I already have been, to NAC as part of their 150-year celebration. And are we not celebrating colonization? Why is this not a gigantic party for reconciliation? And what would that actually look like when we think that it's enough? Yes, Nellifer had just one intervention.
Just very briefly, following up on, coming back to our team as well, idea of home as well is a place of justice. Justice not in terms of just correcting historical wrongs, but as a process, because as you say, as a refugee coming from another country, when first I became aware of the First Nation, and I lived in New Brunswick, went to high school in Moncton, and I was the only non-white, non-European student among the students, and it was treated as a novelty.
Yeah, I was treated as a novelty in Ottawa in the 40s as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But we weren't, as you're suggesting, weren't aware of we were taught about the Confederation history, but nothing about the actual, not until I was in the third year university where I start to seek after, I would have been taught or learned that the places where I went around and relatively saw it as a European weren't necessarily always European. And I think there is something that has to be considered as part of home for all of us, and this event, I guess, is maybe a beautiful place to start thinking about it, is a question of it's a place of justice, and that's how, do we really belong to a place which can open up the door to not correcting history, but moving us forward to the next level, where we all could feel the comfort that you're referring to and the hospitality that you're suggesting. Just echoing on your thoughts, I think it's about time.
Yeah. It's very interesting because also in Canada there was awareness, even in the time when we were in the 40s and 50s, where it was a completely different place. It was so white, and it was a racist, in many ways a racist country. Because I remember my mother, who was a wonderful gardener and had a wonderful garden before, it's like before the fall and after the fall. When you were a refugee, you had the life before and then the life after, right? and my mother was always looking for a place where she could grow rhododendrons. And so she used to say to my father, when we get established, maybe we could move to the West Coast. And my father said, I don't think so. And then we had a wonderful friend who was named Weir Stewart. He had been a war hero, and he was a drunk. And he was marvelous. He used to come to our house and drink all the scotch. And he said to me once, your mother wants to go to the West Coast. I think she told his wife she did. And he said, you never want to go to the West Coast, 80, because that was my nickname, because they'll cut off your pigtails there. And I wondered, what did he mean by that? And then I asked my father. And then he told me about Vancouver. He said, we will never move to the West Coast because they have racial prejudice there, and we don't have it in Ottawa, and you're going to grow up in Ontario, and it's, there may be things, but it's not going to be like that. So that's how much it's evolved. As a result of that, I never came to the West Coast till I was working professionally for the CBC, and I was 28 years old.
And did we cut off your pigtails?
You didn't, because I didn't have them.
Adrian, this part of the room, we have three people who would like to speak. I'm going to ask everybody, Shiraz, Halwake, and then over here, 1 minute, and on, we're heading a certain direction in the conversation. Love to keep going that way.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge. My name is Shiraz, and I consider every person is a fruit tree. So when I hear about Canada being mosaic, I would rather say, are we fruit basket or fruit salad? So my interest is in terms of home as a family, because I live in a seniors housing, and I work with elders, and I say that I have 6 families, and the families I call them, I work at university, so I call university family. I spend 2 hours on transit, so I call the transit family. I swim every day, so I call swimming family. I volunteer, so I call that volunteer family, and I work with gender justice, so I enjoy working with women and men who are working for gender justice. So and the elder family. So I associate, and I carry fruit and poetry with me. So my hospitality is to share fruit and poetry in the buses and everywhere. So I personally want to ask you, can we separate home from family and not stick to the immigration definition of home, where your passport, because I think passport identity should be separated from our ancestry identity and home identity and family. And I think there is a lot of confusion among a lot of people who are born here, whether they're Asians and Africans, and they say, no, we are Canadians. And then people are saying, but you look like African. I'm always told, when I'm told that, are you Indian? And I said, I was born in Africa. And they said, you don't look like African. So I said, thank you, are you Canadian? Yes, you don't look like Indian. So let's read the Bible. So we are all Indians.
Hal, back to, thank you.
Hal.
Thank you, Charlie. I'm afraid I'm not going to follow that path, so you can take what I say and put it on a side table after I'm done. I find the concept of home somewhat nebulous and difficult to pin down, but it brings to mind, to me, the notion of community. And I don't know whether there's an overlap between home and community, but communities transcend geography, they transcend neighborhood. We create our communities together. Sometimes it's a little league and parents getting together to let their kids enjoy a sport, or it's a school community. I'm with the Writers' Festival. I feel deeply engaged with the literary community in this country. And what those communities, they're constantly shifting and changing, and you belong and you move on. What they have in common, I think, is that we're dedicated towards some kind of common goal, and we support each other and we trust each other and we look after each other in those communities.
Thank you. One more intervention.
Thanks. I think I'm one of those Canadians that thinks that we're a country from coast to coast to coast. What's interesting is my mom, as an Indigenous young girl going to residential school, lost her pigtails in Ontario. So you weren't maybe as safe as you thought you were. My daughter, by the way, when you meet her later on today, she has long hair, and I will let her cut her hair when I know that it's 100% her choice because of what that resembles to my family. But going back to President Petter and the SFU community, I was told that this was going to be somewhat, maybe we're going to go deep and we're going to go honest and we're going to be transparent and we're not going to be afraid to put things out there that sometimes we aren't. As an Indigenous scholar, I got emails from across the country over the weekend about SFU closing this. And two questions came up. Why were they doing this? But it was clear in the communication that the students weren't applying and it was low registration. And so right away, the big question is, let's look way upstream. Why did we go to President Petter to answer that question when we have youth in our community that don't have the message that they should be applying to SFU, that they are capable of doing that they can be Governor General? Why are we not reaching out? And interestingly enough, always going to someone like President Petter to say, why aren't all of these people coming to it when I can see day in, day out, so many people in my community, so many youth that you have to tell them without trying to pause because you worry that the message is going to be lost in between your sentences, that they're capable of going to university. They're capable of finishing high school. They're capable of, like Ginger said, of being at the table to actually be part of those discussions about what post-secondary institutions are going to do. And it is a problem for Canada. It's an issue for Canada. It's an opportunity for Canada, and it's an exciting thing for Canada. So whichever way you want to look at it, I think I would encourage everyone here today to wonder, why are our Indigenous youth not believing in themselves as much as they can so that they can be at the door, banging on the door, and SFU having the problem of not having enough money and spaces because they have so many Indigenous applicants.
Is there a SFU student here who would like to comment on this area that we're touching on all the time, coming back to?
If we haven't identified,
okay.
Jocelyn, over in that corner. People in the middle of the rows, please don't feel inhibited. We'll find you with the microphone.
Hi. So my name is Rajitha, and I'm not an Aboriginal youth, but I guess to kind of answer the question or to kind of allude to it, it's kind of the sense where, as much as I'd like to say that education is important and that the next step is important, where do we go after that? Because it's great to say that, you know, the university degree is going to help us, but what about jobs and finding out what the stability of the market is after we get out there? Because I'm going to be graduating at the end of this year, and it's one of those questions where was what I learned worth it? And you were talking about how in the 40s you'd made popsicle houses, and that was what Aboriginal education represented to you. And I graduated in 2013 from high school, and I had the exact same experience in grade school. And that's what really surprises me, is that from the 40s till now, our education system hasn't changed or evolved. And if we're going to make it evolve, we have to be part of that process. And part of being part of that process is that more students like myself need to be involved and heard and be part of the committee or the advisory process. And
what do you feel about you that has not been heard, and why your particular self or cohort of people? What is it?
That's an interesting question. I think last year I went to a smudge ceremony, and that was the first time I'd ever gone to one. And it made me realize that there was so much about Aboriginal history that I didn't really understand and had never taken the time to understand. And the fact that at 21, I'm supposed to be finishing school and I should have all this vast experience of knowledge, and yet I didn't. And that really bothered me.
You felt your education had not been a full education, is that it? That there were huge gaps in it?
Exactly. I mean, I immigrated here. And
From where?
From India.
Uh-huh.
And I am Sikh, and so we don't cut our hair. And I knew the exact same story that I'd felt when I'd gone to the smudge ceremony. She'd been talking about how hard it was to lose her hair. And yet I was here and I didn't understand that. And I'd been here since I was 3 and I didn't understand that. And that really bothered me.
You know, I think that brings up some really interesting ideas about multiple identities. The multiple identities we have in Canada, because we all do. We've brought different things with us, and then we come here and we're not the same. I believe that we become transformed in some way, and that idea of transformation, we might learn a lot from Aboriginal peoples about it, because transformation has a very important place in Aboriginal thinking and doing and being, actually. And transformation is something that we're struggling with. You know, in the whole gender movement, it's really about that, and people understanding how people are able to change and be different. And in Canada, you know, what I'm interested on, I used to say to my father, luckily he lived till he was 96, and I'd say to him, what do you think our life would have been like if there hadn't been a war? And we'd stayed in Hong Kong and say, you know, Japanese had not taken Hong Kong. Say it had just been what we were, you know, upper middle class, colonial type Chinese people, speaking excellent English, Anglican for 5 generations, you know, the anomalies of empire. What would we have been like? What would have become of me? And he said to me, you know, you were very bright. We would have sent you to the United States to go to Radcliffe or Wellesley, a nice women's college, he said. And then maybe you would have married an American, but you wouldn't have married a Canadian. And then I said, and then I wouldn't have been Governor General of Canada. And you don't know what life holds in store for you. You have no idea what, you know, you're thrown into something, you come out another way. It is completely different. And that's why our whole nation, and we have never accepted that in a way. And that's why we need to accept the whole culture that is the Aboriginal, different aspects of Aboriginal culture, because they can help us with that transformation. They can help us to understand what it is like to be human beings that transform. And you know that, Ivan. Yeah.
You keep doing this to me.
Yeah, I do.
Well, interesting. I was just thinking about hair, okay? Because I was forced to grow my hair. I was the opposite as a kid. I was supposed to be a good little Catholic girl in the Yukon. And so I was forced to grow my hair. So you can see how I've answered that in my adult 3 weeks, every 3 weeks, whether I need it or not, right? Straight down. And, you know, when we talk about public spaces or in a public space, are we in a public space? Are we in a public space right now? Truly. Like, is it, because public means by all the people, for all the people. It doesn't mean by most of the people, most of the time, right? And we all saw what we walked through, the part of town that we walked through to come in here today, and who was welcome in the door truly, and who the security would follow around when they came in. And are we truly in a public space if it's not accessible?
Huh.
Good
question.
If deaf people are not a part of this conversation? Mm-hmm. If trans people are not welcome in the physical space, are we? Although I did notice that you did the trans colors for me, so I really appreciate that. Just to make me feel at home. Just paint it all pink and blue. So if that's what you're asking me to address, I mean, yeah, I'm always going to have 1 foot in one place and 1 foot in the other, like geographically and in other ways.
I just wanted to go back to a question about education and I have had that feeling for the past 10 years that yes, we have to listen more to what First Nations and Aboriginal people have to share back to us. And like Ginger said, there's tons of issues in the communities that have to be overcome and faced first, perhaps, but hopefully soon enough we can have a constructive dialogue so I can learn from you in terms of, you know, we all talk about sustainable environment and protecting our environment. Well, this is something that's ingrained in Mother Earth concept. Like, I cannot just live off the land. I give, I take, I give, I take. It's all in balance. It's things like that that I think we have to listen to. But again, with education, what are the stories that are being told to us? And I'm in my late 30s, and just now, and because random thing, I read a very compelling story of a little girl, at 16, she became a teacher in Alaska. And that story I read was so compelling and so well written that I wanted to read more. Then by myself, I'm trying to find that path to knowing more and to discovering that Montreal is on Mohawk land. Okay, is there a book I can read of someone that I can relate to and start having feelings about what happened and really getting the story? And thankfully enough, there's a wonderful series of books that I bumped into and that John Russell Saul here was, I think, commissioning or something on Extraordinary Canadians. And it just happened so that I just read the story of Big Bear recently. And that, for one of the first time in my life, put me in a place where I could start to really understand how the treaties were signed, even though I hear about them and I know there's injustice, but where, how, I don't know. I don't know anything. And then the next question is, okay, what do I do? There's not much I can do, quite frankly, other than educate myself and be aware, and at the opportune time, at the good time, perhaps there will be a conversation where I can pull strings or help convening or whatever. But it's very difficult as an individual to say, I want to right the wrongs or I want to participate in reconciliation. We, quite frankly, don't know how to do that. I'm experimenting about reconciliation.
Well, I think what you've touched on is very important because we're talking about education about Aboriginal issues as though we were dealing with them in a political science type way, you know, looking at the structure of Germany and the Bunds, you know, looking at Aboriginal things and how they organize themselves, when in fact, what we are really talking about is a whole way of being and understanding of the world, which is very different, which we haven't scratched the surface of yet in our attempts to educate people, or to be able to look at that kind of thing. And I think that's what's really missing. And in many ways, our courts are ahead of us. You know, the Supreme Court has accepted the fact that the oral tradition, as the natives said it, is more valid than what was written down at the time. That is the way in which natives were able to listen and report back has been accepted by our Canadian legal system as being the valid one in the case of, is it Demchuk? Richard, what is it? It's Delgaman, yes. And that is so critical, and yet we don't realize that as Canadians, that the oral tradition it's not just, oh, I think they said, but they, memorized it, just as people in remote parts of Turkey still can do 20,000 word poems because it's oral tradition. And in all these mountainous areas, they can do that. We have that in this country.
Adrian, I'd love to get the room involved. We have many people who'd like to. I know Nelafir and Shirash as well.
She's been raising.
Yes, I have 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, let's go.
We're going to go quickly. 1, 2, and then Jocelyn 3, and then over there for 4. Yes.
So, Kim Hudson, on the question of belonging and are we home, I think that it starts with a feeling, like if it's a very individual sense of, do I feel seen? Do I feel like I can have an authentic voice? And which brought me to this question of love. And I think we need to look at love a lot more broadly. It's any time you feel a connection, all the feelings, respect would be a part of love, and that I see the connection of our humanity. So just that would be my contribution.
This gentleman, and then over to you, Jocelyn.
Chris Reason. just following the discussion around Indigenous populations. So Canada has gone through an incredible experience in this last year with Operation Syrian Refugee, 44,000 refugees coming out of the Civil War. But nobody knew about the First Peoples. So here we are. The new Trudeau government has introduced a new baseline of 300,000 immigrants in 2017, and that number will likely increase to 450,000. And by 2030, all of our net population growth will come from immigration. And nobody knows about Indigenous populations. So I guess my question, and my colleagues across the country that work in immigrant serving agencies have been asking the government, is it about time that as part of the pre-arrival, pre-orientation services, that's the 300,000 are coming in, have some indication of Indigenous populations? So it's a question and a comment.
That's what we have said.
I have to just comment on that, because at the round tables that we have at our citizenship ceremonies in our Building Citizen program of the ICC, when we get together in the round tables for 10 minutes for the hour before they become citizens, that's one of the fun parts of it. They sit down, and there are a couple of facilitators who are established Canadians, and we ask them about the thing is they talk about the weather. But the one thing that comes up again and again is, what about the Indigenous people? Where are they? Who are they? Are they living, if it's in Toronto, they say, are there any in Toronto? There are 85,000 in downtown Toronto, and they know nothing about this. They're not taught about it in any meaningful way, and it has not entered our education system. What about an education system which would teach us, for instance, the way we used to, when I was a child, memorize Tennyson and Yeats and so on, his poems, and had to get up and memorize his poem and say it to the class. What about teaching classes of people to actually do oral translations? What do you remember from what somebody says to you? And this is what how Aboriginal people have always remembered things. Not just storytelling or making it folkloric. It's not about that. It's about actually how they transmitted truth, how they transmitted history, and we've never done anything like that. Aboriginal education has not extended to that kind of thing. And I don't think it even has in Saskatchewan, has it, David? I mean, you're a treaty commissioner. I remember going into classes with children with you, and they would say, we are treaty people, because you got everybody in Saskatchewan to say, we're treaty people, but they know that.
I think Nelly wants to intervene, and then we also have...
Very quickly,
yeah.
I think it's also perception of Canada and the Indigenous people abroad. It's not just the homework at home.
Right.
But I often been asked the question, oh, so are you living in this whatever snow house in Canada?
Mm-hmm.
And because a lot of things that have been done abroad as well as just been symbolic, there are often just been, for example, a beautiful dance, but the concepts behind it, the notions, the philosophy behind it has never been properly explained. So as much as we have the work to do at home, but also I think the people who are coming here, and I'm not just talking about Syrians, we receive a huge number of immigrants who come to this country who choose to come here for other reasons other than civil war. They have a very limited image of Canada and the First Nation, but that image, like in my mind in my school grade 4 book, there was a snow house and a man covered in fur. That image has never been challenged or changed in the perception of those who arrive here. So it's just another side of the same story.
Adrian, over in the corners.
Thank you very much, and it's such a delight to have this conversation. I'd like to perhaps pivot. My name is June Francis. I'm also on the Board of Governors of Simon Fraser University, but I'm also, what I'd like to address, though, is the fact that I think home is a place where you share power, okay? Mm-hmm. We've just completed some research recently that show really low levels. And in this case, our methodology was around visible minorities on boards across this country. And for we're looking at levels of 11%, 6%. Incredibly low levels of visible minorities in areas of leadership and in areas of governance. And so very few people are talking for the rest of us. So the second point I want to make very briefly as well is that there are uncomfortable truths that we have to face if we want to be honest. I come from what is often called a visible minority group, a racialized minority. I've been in this country for forever. Do I feel at home? No, because my home is not a place. A home should be a place where my children thrive, where they're not followed in supermarkets, where they're not followed, their taxes don't stop for them, and where 2 black kids that I know personally died in the last 2 weeks because of feeling isolated, dejected, not included. And these are kids, let me tell you, whose parents cared for them, who played basketball with my son. So it's driven home to me when I hear from him the feeling of isolation in this country. And these are kids that were born here. So when there are racialized minority groups in this country, we don't share power, but we're constantly having to educate the world. And we do not feel at home. And people will say, oh, you have arrived, June, how could you not feel at home? But in all honesty, I spend most of my life explaining myself. It's tiring. It's really tiring. No.
I think this idea of having to explain yourself is interesting. But you wanted to say something else, Ginger.
Yeah. Canada's extremely culturally neutral. Like, it's seeping into the bones of this country. You know, for the last 150 years, we have valued this whitewashed, culturally neutral concept of society and governance and the people that we value and the people that we want to recognize and how we want to recognize them. And it's pretty obvious today that we are a country and we are a generation and a group of people that want to erase that notion that culture is not a value. I think we definitely hear today that our next Canada is going to be one that's built on the premise of we all belong here, this is our home. We have to make it that way. We have to be welcoming. We have to extend. We have to know our histories. We have to know who we are, where we're welcome. None of that is apparent today, and I think we have to be uncomfortable and tear it down because nobody else is going to do it for us. You know, so we can sit here and talk about how much we dislike not knowing about this history, how much we dislike being profiled as we're walking through stores, but we are also the ones that need to stop it as well, and let's empower ourselves.
I've got a thought here, Charlie. I've got a thought here from an intervener who would like to carry on in the same direction. Here we go.
Hi, my name is Vanessa. I'm kind of feeling like I'm losing the thread a little bit, but what I've been thinking about as I've been hearing everyone else share is kind of going off what you're saying, like home, but home for who? For myself, like I'm a child of immigrants. I'm the first in my family to be born on Turtle Island in North America. And I remember distinctly when I was born in Victoria, on the Kongan and Sanic territories, home was like just this safe space, this place where I belonged, this place where I had neighbors, where I knew people's names and could just walk into their homes and just feel like I was accepted. And at some point, this question of like where home is didn't start happening until I started feeling like I didn't belong, until other people started making me question like why I was there or what home was or where home was. So coming in forms of like, where are you from? No, but where are you really from? No, but like, where are your parents from? And then even going so far as like, okay, if I'm not Canadian, then am I Vietnamese? And then going to Vietnam and then going like, well, this is my Canadian cousin. And so always growing up, I had this massive identity crisis of figuring out like who am I then? And as I got older, you know, as I started exploring my sexual orientation, my gender identity, you know, even my interactions in the everyday are always people, other people, forcing me to question like if I really belong here. Like, is this the right bathroom to be in? Is this the right space to be in to really be myself? It just feels like home is like a really contentious thing for me personally, but I also think for many other people. As much as we want to find home, as much as we feel like there's small spaces that we can find home, everywhere else, everywhere we turn, continuously reminds us this is not our home, that we're not supposed to be here, and especially we're not supposed to be who we really are in this particular space. Yeah, those are just the things I've been thinking about.
I became South Asian when I got here. Before that, you don't.
You were just an Indian.
When you're in India, you don't think I'm South Asian. So suddenly I'm dealing with this whole new thing.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things of being Canadian, is that, of course, people always say, and, you know, you do it yourself. You'll get into, whenever, because I want to know myself, but when I get into a cab or when I'm dealing with somebody, I always say, well, you know, are you Canadian? When did you come from? Where did you come from? If they have an accent, it's obvious that that they have, we're not born here usually. And then I get a wonderful story. And they usually are, 99% of them are Canadian. They've been here from 5 to 25 years. They've done various things. When they're driving cabs, I ask them what their children are doing. Oh, you know, my daughter is at Algonquin College, and my son is going into life sciences, etc. So you hear wonderful sort of stories, and that is what Canada is going to be. It's going to be about finding multiple identities, and also of. I wouldn't be disturbed by people saying to you, where are you originally from? I get that all my life. I still get that. And I think it's very interesting because it makes you think, where do you come from? And it makes you think, I spent a lot of time in France. They just had their election. Thank God it worked a little bit, all right. But that's where they never have a question of who they are. I am French. With all that implies. 1548, where the French language dominated, and all the little local languages, they had about 50 local languages, they were all forbidden. Nobody was allowed to speak Corsican or Norman or Breton. They were all made one. What's the benefit of that? I mean, people are not trying to insult you by asking you where you come from, really. They're just interested, sort of vaguely. And it is, for us, interesting now because we get all sorts of different people from different places. I make it a little game to try to figure out, whether somebody's Eritrean, Somalian, or Ethiopian, because I like to look at the physiognomies, and it's very interesting. And we have that kind of discussion, and we talk about, the Christianity that is in Ethiopia. And I bought any number of tapes because they were raising $2 million to build an Ethiopian church, and every cab driver would give you one, and you would always buy one to help them with the church. I don't worry about that. Why do you worry about it when you've got, you know that in this country you have all your rights and freedoms guaranteed by a Charter of Rights? I know that's sort of vague, but it's not as though people are wanting to exclude you from that. I really take that up. I'll discuss it with you later.
I think there's lots of thoughts on that
question. A forceful intervention, then maybe
Kari?
We can wrap it up with each of the interveners.
Yes, each of you.
I apologize. We're going to have to shelve a lot of comments until the next session.
But we have a discussion thing after this.
Of course we do, yes.
My name's Kari, and the thing that I find troubling about that is that white people never have to deal with that.
Yes.
And that it's actually about the neutrality of whiteness.
Well, can I object to that?
Is that it's about the neutrality of whiteness. It's like
not
that
necessarily.
is
I don't agree with that. No, French Canadians get that.
So when I travel to France, I'm always reminded of my accent. And I get the full story of how they love Celine Dion and Linda Lemay and everything.
Yeah.
So I know what it is to be tired, to explain
condescending.
where you're coming from.
And when when you say you're an English Anglophone Canadian in France and you speak good French, they say, oh, but you're so lucky you don't have that funny little accent of the cousins. Yeah.
Okay, well, again, I'll repeat what I said the last time, that there's a baseline that whiteness is what's Canadian, and that's why they ask the question over and over again. So outside of that, I just wanted to say something else. And that is that there's a third way, it seems to me, that isn't a settler or someone who's indigenous, and that is that there were millions of Africans who were brought to this part of the world, not of their own will. And that I always find it troubling to situate myself within that context, because that's how my family came here.
Did they come, tell me about the history, because I think that's interesting. What's the history of your family?
So my family in the 1800s, one of my great-great-great-grandmother, her name is Kizzy. I always like to bring her name into space. She escaped from slavery in the 1850s and came into Canada, but what I like to do to complicate that narrative, because Canada really likes to feel good about itself in relationship to slavery, is that slaves actually existed in Canada. Slavery was a thing in Canada, but also that is where my grandmother lost her legs. She froze her legs off in the middle of the winter in Canada because there wasn't appropriate housing for her. So I think that just like, for me, it's important to make this, I always say, paint the picture round, like tell the story in a round way that tells the fullness of the whole thing, which makes it uncomfortable for all of us in a certain way, because we have to deal with the fact that we've actually done so much harm under the name of Canada. And it's actually really hard for me. I was born in the States. I've lived here. There's been so many relative betterments for my own quality of life. You know, I have health care. I'm from Detroit. I don't have to deal with gunshots and with certain kinds of things. But, you know, the place that I've been racially profiled by the police is in Canada. It's in Vancouver. And I have to deal with that there. I'm not, you know, I just want to try and, like, I guess, complicate these notions, like, and I think that's part of what we're doing here. But I feel like, you know, there are some things that just keep on getting perpetuated, and like the education point that you made, like, I thought was just like incredible, because our history is quite complex, and there's all these different things that are sitting on top of each other. While it was good for my great-great-great-grandmother to come here, it was also an indigenous land, you know, and it's like all of these things compiled on top of each other. It's really difficult for me to feel a sense of ease and at home, you know, on a certain level. And I love my community and I love my friends here, but I also have this underlying awareness that I don't feel comfortable in a certain way.
So I think we're going to wrap up for the open exchanges. Thank you. So I'll just start around this way for just a little finish up with all of us before we go into the open exchanges. Ginger?
Being an Indigenous person in another Indigenous nation's territories, doing the work that I do, still don't feel entirely welcome. Not by the Indigenous peoples. I feel incredibly embraced by Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, but like, it's not easy doing this work, answering everybody's questions, trying to educate. I think that's a big issue that I think my communities will have to struggle with. I would like some awareness for everybody here as well, that it takes a lot of work to feel welcome. If I'm going to welcome you, if we're going to welcome you, I need to feel welcome as well.
Ghettoization of minorities, I think we also have a part in that ourselves. I feel part of being a Canadian is more than anything else is shared values that we respect and tolerate and are having empathy and trying to understand each other. I welcome the thought that someone could ask me where I am from, because I see it as an opportunity. But when I lived in the ghetto of my own community, that became an uncomfortable question, because our histories are complicated, as you're suggesting. There are a lot of uncomfortable things about it that is difficult to face. But I also feel that it's a kind of a dialogue that has to happen both ways. And the fear of remaining so politically correct and crossing over not to ask, where are you from? I saw that in an example last year when I was in Syria, where an historian was telling me that the way the society functioned was that people would say proudly, oh, I didn't know that for 25 years I was friends with this guy, and only when I went to his father's funeral I discovered that he was a Christian and I was a Muslim. And his criticism was that for 25 years we missed the opportunity to learn about each other, to enrich each other from experiences and differences of our unique cultures and our religious cultures, and therefore we are in a mess in some extent, not all of it blamed on that, but in part because of missed opportunities to learn about each other and to ask those difficult questions and be uncomfortable. So that's where I would leave it, and I hope we'll carry on with this conversation.
I just wanted to tell a really quick story. I got into a taxi months ago, and I never ask the cab driver where he's from. It's just my bottom line. I just don't do it anymore. And even if I'm wondering. So he was looking at me in the mirror, in the rearview mirror. And then he said to me, "Can I ask you a question?" And I thought, yeah, of course. I mean, fair's fair. And he said, "I've always wondered about your people, something about your people." And I, by default, thought he meant queer, and I don't know why I thought that, but that's what I thought he meant. And he said, "Do you live alone?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." He said, "You don't live with your family?" Because I live with my wife, and I live with my wife's mother, and I live with my kid, and my brother's here as well, and I wonder, like, are you robbing yourself of your family? I've always wondered that. And so I said, well, you know, I guess my people, and I meant queer people, I guess we sometimes are forced out of our families in a way, or we're forced out of our small towns, and we have to come to a bigger city because it's so-called more diverse, or it's more, although I've been gay bashed twice, and it was both times in Vancouver, but anyway, I've never had that happen in a small town. But anyway, I went on explaining to him why I think maybe some queer people are, like, maybe we don't have kids as easily, we have to be more conscious about that, it's not like a mistake in my family. So I went on and on and on and explained to him, thinking that he was meaning queer people. And he said, "Oh, thank you. I've always wondered that about white people."
Natalie?
Just about home, and I talked about education and reading and compelling stories. This is one of my things. Right now in Montreal, I live in a neighborhood that's called Pointe Saint-Charles, which was very, very important in the economic development of the city back in the 19th century. So someone told me about this book that I just finished on the plane coming here, and for some reason, I'm not of Irish descent, or I may be, but I don't know about it. But I was able to place on the map that my house is actually in the very Irish neighborhood, or part of this neighborhood. And for some reason, I now have a connection with the Irish people who came here. And there's a cemetery that's very not well acknowledged near the Victoria Bridge, and I feel connected to those people who died of typhus while immigrating. So I'm thinking now, and especially with reconciliation, I'm like, okay, if all of my white colonialist story has to be rewritten, I would like to be part of a positive story, and I would like to go back to my ancestors to find perhaps the one time where there perhaps was a métissage between an indigenous person, and, you know, in my ancestry, there's a good chances that this happened. And I would love to feel that connection, to know that somewhere in my history, somewhere on the territory that I live on, positive things happened that I could relate to and be proud of. And so I don't know, of course, I'm a white Francophone Canadian, everything, you know, all that the bad is associated with. But me personally, this is how I would like to go on and continue understanding where I am from, and just this creating that sense of belonging with different cultures and stories.
Serge?
It feels like we started as a group sort of with an agreement that home meant one thing, kind of a sanctuary. But I think together we've kind of complicated that a bit. And I think, you know, there's this beautiful book called The Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelard, where he looks at a house and he says, there's an attic and there's a basement. So even home is full of paradoxes, and every room has a different feeling, and we, I think, change our relationship to it as we change. So I really feel we are in the middle of an experiment, a country-sized experiment. And I'm hopeful that we can continue to create spaces like this where, in fact, I hope that we are a little less polite as we go along, because politeness is the opposite of passion. And I think we need a little bit of passion and a little bit of friction to understand why we're feeling this lack of identity jointly.
I think that's a very important point, and I think we may want to pick it up. We're going to have open exchanges now. We'll have them on education, because that came up in a very meaningful and timely way, on language, the kind of languages we use, on identity, on what we are, what we think we are, what we may be and don't know yet, and the whole idea, I think, of telling our stories. And I think if we can break out that way, we will have a great discussion, and we will be able to carry on until lunch hour. So,
Adrian,
Jocelyn.
yes.
Yes.
Let me first thank all the guests for the first 360. Natalie Chapdelaine, Ivan Coyote, Melissa Cheers, Ginger Gosno, Myers, and of course Shirish Rao and Adrian. Thank you. Before I turn it over to Jocelyn to explain the breakouts, thank you so much for those interventions. We couldn't get to even half of them. That's a very strong start. I agree with Shirish. We've just opened it up, and yes, a little less politeness will be just fine for the rest of the day. I've just decided that for each session, the person who waited the most patiently and I couldn't get to will receive a 6 Degrees pin, and it's going to this gentleman right here, and who will be we'll find him next session.